The year was 1879, and Thomas Brennan, a rancher of 32 years, occupied a weathered timber cabin that stood alone against the sprawling expanse of the New Mexico Territory. His existence had settled into a predictable cadence of dawn risings, cattle drives, fence repairs, and the eternal companionship of silence. The nearest town lay 2 days' ride to the east, and he ventured there only when supplies demanded it. He had grown comfortable with isolation, his conversations limited to the occasional passing trader and the patient ears of his horses. But on that summer evening, as the sun descended behind distant mesas and painted the sky in shades of crimson and violet, the steady rhythm of his solitary life came to an abrupt and irreversible halt. Thomas had been riding the southern boundary of his property, inspecting the water sources after weeks of drought had turned the grasslands brittle and yellow. The heat of the day still clung to the air, thick and oppressive, making each breath feel labored. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Ruth, picked her way carefully along the rocky terrain, her ears swiveling at every sound. It was Ruth who noticed it first, her steps faltering, her head lifting with sudden alertness. Thomas followed her gaze toward a cluster of cottonwood trees that marked the presence of a seasonal creek, now reduced to scattered pools of stagnant water. At first, he saw only a dark shape among the roots, something that might have been a fallen branch or a sleeping animal. But as he urged Ruth forward, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle secured to his saddle, the shape resolved itself into something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a person, a woman, lying motionless at the water's edge. Her clothing was torn, stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Her skin was the deep bronze of the Apache people, and her long black hair spread around her like a dark halo, tangled with leaves and dust. Thomas dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He approached cautiously, years of frontier caution warring with the immediate impulse to help. She was young, perhaps close to his own age, her face bearing the marks of recent violence. A dark bruise spread across her left cheek, and her lower lip was split and swollen. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her chest rising and falling with fragile determination. She wore a simple dress of deerskin, now torn at the shoulder and stained with mud. Around her wrists were marks, angry red lines that suggested she had been bound. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling across her face. At his movement, her eyes opened, dark as the night sky and filled with an immediate, visceral wariness. She tried to pull away, her body tensing despite its obvious weakness, and a sound escaped her throat, something between a warning and a plea. Thomas raised his hands slowly, palms open, speaking in a low, steady voice though he suspected she might not understand his words. "Easy now. I'm not here to harm you. You're hurt." She watched him with the intensity of a cornered animal, her eyes tracking every movement. When he reached for his canteen, she flinched, but thirst and exhaustion had clearly taken their toll. He unscrewed the cap and held it toward her, waiting. After a long moment, her trembling hand reached out and she took it, drinking in desperate gulps that made her cough and sputter. He wanted to tell her to slow down, but the words seemed pointless. When she had drunk her fill, she let the canteen drop and her eyes found his again, searching for something he couldn't name. Thomas knew the stories. He had heard them around campfires and in saloons, tales of settlers who had taken in wounded natives and paid for it with their lives or their livelihoods. The Apache wars had left scars on both sides, suspicion running deep as river canyons. His neighbors would not understand this. The territorial authorities might see it as collaboration. But as he looked at this broken woman lying in the dust, all he could see was another human being in desperate need. He made his decision without fully thinking it through, moved by an instinct older than reason. Carefully, speaking softly all the while, he slid his arms beneath her shoulders and knees. She was lighter than he expected, her frame delicate despite the strength he could sense in her muscles. She did not fight him, perhaps because she lacked the strength, or perhaps because something in his manner had communicated his intentions. Her head lolled against his chest as he carried her to Ruth, and he could feel the heat of fever radiating from her skin. Getting her onto the horse required careful maneuvering. Thomas mounted first, then pulled her up in front of him, settling her against his chest with one arm wrapped securely around her waist. She slumped into him, her body going slack with exhaustion. Ruth shifted under the extra weight but held steady as Thomas turned her toward home. The ride back took twice as long as usual, Thomas keeping Ruth to a careful walk to avoid jostling his injured passenger more than necessary. The sun had fully set by the time the cabin came into view, a dark shape against the star-scattered sky. The windows were black and empty, and for a moment Thomas felt the full weight of what he was doing. He was bringing an Apache woman, injured and alone, into his home. He was stepping across an invisible line that divided his world from hers, and he had no idea what consequences might follow. But as her weight settled more heavily against him, her breathing shallow and labored, he pushed those thoughts aside. Right now, she needed help. Tomorrow would have to take care of itself. He dismounted carefully, then lifted her down with the same gentleness, carrying her through the cabin door. The interior was dark and smelled of leather and wood smoke. He laid her on his bed, the only bed in the single-room cabin, then moved quickly to light the oil lamp that hung from a ceiling beam. Warm light flooded the space, revealing the sparse furnishings, a table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with supplies, his bedroll in the corner. It was a bachelor's dwelling, functional and bare. Thomas built up the fire, coaxing flames from the banked coals, then filled a pot with water from the barrel by the door and set it to heat. While he waited, he found clean cloths, his medical supplies such as they were, a bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds, salve made from herbs and animal fat, bandages cut from old sheets. He worked with the efficiency of someone used to tending injuries alone, though never before had he treated someone else. When the water was warm, he carried it to the bedside along with his supplies. She was awake, watching him with those dark, unreadable eyes. He showed her each item before using it, moving slowly, giving her time to understand that he meant no harm. When he began cleaning the cuts on her face and arms, she flinched but did not pull away. The injuries were numerous, marks of systematic beating rather than accident. His jaw tightened with anger at whoever had done this, but he kept his touch gentle, his movements careful. There were bruises on her arms, her ribs, places where fists had landed with deliberate cruelty. The marks around her wrists were rope burns, deep and raw. He cleaned each wound with whiskey-soaked cloth, applied the salve, wrapped what needed wrapping. Through it all, she remained silent, her eyes never leaving his face. He wondered what she saw there, if she could read the combination of anger and compassion that churned inside him. When he had finished, he found a clean shirt from his trunk, one of the few good ones he owned, and offered it to her. She looked at it, then at him, and he gestured to her torn dress before turning his back to give her privacy. He heard the rustle of fabric, the soft sounds of movement, and when he turned around again she was wearing his shirt, which hung nearly to her knees. She had pulled her hair over one shoulder and was working her fingers through the tangles with painful slowness. Thomas found a comb on his shelf, one he rarely used himself, and brought it to her. She took it hesitantly, as if unsure whether this too might be a trick, but when he simply nodded and stepped back, she began to work it through her hair with determined patience. He busied himself preparing food, simple fare of dried meat, bread, and beans reheated from lunch. He set a plate beside her and watched as she ate with the careful deliberation of someone who had not eaten in days. The night deepened around them, the cabin a small island of light in the vast darkness of the plains. Thomas sat in one of the chairs, his rifle within reach out of habit more than fear, and watched her eat. When she had finished, she set the plate aside and looked at him directly, her gaze steady despite the exhaustion that pulled at her features. She spoke, her voice rough from disuse and injury, words in a language he did not understand. But the tone was clear, gratitude mixed with wariness, a question wrapped in statement. He wished desperately that he could speak her language, could explain himself, could understand her story. Instead, he pointed to himself and said, "Thomas." Then he gestured to her, eyebrows raised in question. She watched him for a long moment, then touched her own chest and said something that sounded like, "Ayasha." He repeated it, stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables, and saw the faintest flicker of something that might have been approval in her eyes. "Ayasha," he said again, more carefully this time. She nodded once, then said his name in return, her accent transforming it into something both familiar and strange. It felt like a beginning, however small. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Thomas found blankets and made himself a bed by the fire, insisting through gestures that she take the bed. She protested weakly, but exhaustion won out. Within minutes of lying down, her eyes had closed and her breathing had deepened into sleep. Thomas lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to her breathe, wondering what he had set in motion. Sleep came eventually, but it was restless and filled with fragmented dreams. He woke twice during the night, each time checking to make sure she was still breathing, still safe. The second time, he found her eyes open, watching the play of firelight on the ceiling. Their gazes met across the room, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of their strange circumstance, before she closed her eyes again and returned to sleep. Morning came with the harsh light of the New Mexico sun streaming through the window. Thomas woke to find Ayasha already awake, sitting up in the bed with the blankets pulled around her shoulders. She looked better than she had the night before, the sleep and food having restored some color to her face, but the bruises remained vivid against her skin. When she saw him stirring, she spoke, a string of words in her own language that he could not interpret. He rose and added wood to the fire, then set about making coffee and heating leftover cornbread for breakfast. He could feel her watching him as he moved around the cabin, and he tried to project calm, to show her through his actions that she was safe here. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 cups and brought one to her. She took it carefully, holding the cup in both hands, and sipped tentatively before her eyes widened slightly. She had never tasted coffee before, he realized, and he smiled at her reaction. They ate in silence, but it was a more comfortable silence than the night before. When they had finished, Thomas began his morning routine, conscious of her presence but trying not to alter his habits too much. He needed to tend the animals, check the water troughs, inspect the fence line on the eastern boundary. But he hesitated to leave her alone, uncertain whether she would be there when he returned. As if sensing his dilemma, Ayasha stood, moving stiffly, and began clearing the breakfast dishes. She moved around the cabin with purpose despite her injuries, finding the water basin, washing the plates with competent efficiency. Thomas watched, surprised, as she then began to sweep the floor with the worn broom that leaned in the corner. She was making herself useful, he realized, claiming a place here through work rather than words. He decided to trust her. Pointing to himself, then to the door, he tried to communicate that he would be outside working. She nodded understanding, and he saw something in her expression that might have been relief. She did not want to be treated as an invalid or a prisoner. She wanted purpose. Thomas spent the morning working, but his mind was never far from the cabin. He found himself hurrying through tasks that normally took longer, eager to return and make sure she was still there, still safe. When he finally came back inside, he found the cabin transformed. She had not only cleaned but organized, putting things in order with an eye he had never possessed. The floor was swept, the dishes arranged, even his scattered clothing had been folded and stacked. She stood by the fireplace, stirring something in the pot, and the smell that filled the cabin was unlike anything he had smelled there before. She had found his meager supplies of vegetables and dried herbs and had created something that transcended his usual plain fare. When she served it, he tasted flavors he could not name, combinations that spoke of a culinary tradition entirely different from his own. He ate gratefully, meeting her eyes across the table, and saw in them a quiet pride. She was showing him what she could offer, what she could contribute. After the meal, Thomas decided to attempt communication in earnest. He pointed to objects around the cabin and spoke their names in English, then gestured for her to provide the word in her language. Table. Fire. Water. Door. Window. She caught on quickly, her intelligence evident in how swiftly she grasped his intention. They spent the afternoon like this, building a bridge of vocabulary, word by word. She taught him her language with equal patience, correcting his pronunciation with gentle firmness. But there were some things that required more than simple nouns. As the sun began to set and they sat by the fire, Thomas found himself needing to know her story, to understand how she had come to be lying injured by the creek. He pointed to her bruises, his expression questioning, and saw her face close off immediately. The wariness returned to her eyes, and she looked away from him, into the fire. He waited, not pushing, simply sitting in silence and letting her decide whether to trust him with her truth. Minutes passed, the fire crackling between them, and then, haltingly, she began to speak. Her English was limited, supplemented with gestures and expressions, but the story she told was clear enough in its essential tragedy. She had been promised to a man, she said, pointing to her ring finger. An old man, she added, making a gesture that suggested age and perhaps authority. She shook her head firmly, indicating her refusal, and then pointed to her bruises. The man had been angry, she conveyed, and his family had beaten her for her defiance. The marks on her wrists came next in her story, pantomiming being tied, being held. But she had escaped, she said with fierce pride, had run through the night, had chosen freedom over submission. Thomas listened with growing anger, his fists clenching involuntarily. The details might be unclear, but the core of the story was brutally simple. She had been offered as a bride to a man she did not want, had refused, and had been punished for that refusal. The fact that she had escaped, had survived, spoke to a strength of will that he found himself admiring deeply. She had risked everything, her life included, rather than accept a fate she found intolerable. When she finished, silence fell between them again, but it was different now. He knew her story, understood the courage it had taken to flee, recognized the danger she still faced if her people came looking for her. He met her eyes across the fire and spoke, knowing she would not understand most of his words but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. "You're safe here, Ayasha. As long as you want to stay, you have a place here. No one will force you into anything. You have my word on that." She tilted her head, studying his face as he spoke, and though the words themselves were foreign, something in his expression must have communicated his intent. She nodded slowly, then said something in her own language, her voice soft but firm. He did not know the words, but he understood the meaning: gratitude, acceptance, and perhaps the first tentative extension of trust. The days that followed established a new rhythm in the cabin. Thomas continued his work on the ranch, and Ayasha continued to heal, her strength returning day by day. But beyond the physical recovery, something else was developing between them. The language barrier remained significant, but they found ways to communicate. Gestures became a shared vocabulary. Facial expressions carried meaning. Laughter, when it came, needed no translation. Thomas taught her more English words each day, writing them in the dust or dirt when possible so she could see their structure. She proved a quick study, her mind sharp despite her lack of formal education. Within a week, she could string together simple sentences, her accent thick but her meaning clear. She taught him words from her language in return, and he found himself enjoying the challenge of mastering the unfamiliar sounds. But it was not just language that they shared. Ayasha began to teach him about the plants that grew on his own land, plants he had walked past 1,000 times without recognizing their value. She showed him which ones could be eaten, which could heal, which should be avoided. She gathered roots and berries and created dishes that transformed his plain diet into something richer. She tanned a deerskin he had been planning to sell, turning it into soft leather with skills he did not possess. In return, Thomas taught her about the ranch, about the cattle and horses, about the rhythms of settler life. She learned to milk the cow with surprising ease, to collect eggs from the chickens without startling them, to read the signs of changing weather in the sky. She was not content to remain inside the cabin but ventured out with him, limping at first but growing stronger, her curiosity evident in every question she asked. 3 weeks after he had found her, as they sat together preparing vegetables for the evening meal, Ayesha spoke with careful deliberation, piecing together the English words she had learned. "Thomas," she said, and he looked up from the potato he was peeling. "Why you help me?" "You know, danger." "For you." It was a fair question, one he had asked himself more than once in the dark hours before dawn. He set down his knife and considered his answer carefully, wanting to give her the truth. "Because it was right," he said finally. "Because you needed help, and I could give it. Because—" He paused, searching for words that would not sound foolish, because everyone deserves to be free. To choose their own path. She watched him as he spoke, her dark eyes intent on his face. When he finished, she nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she spoke again, and her words, though halting, carried the weight of truth. "My people, they come maybe. Look for me. If they find—" She drew a finger across her throat in a gesture that needed no explanation. "You in danger too, for help me. I think I should go. Not bring trouble." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest at her words. The thought of her leaving, of the cabin returning to its former emptiness, was suddenly unbearable. But more than that, the thought of her out there alone, vulnerable, perhaps caught and dragged back to the fate she had fled, filled him with a protective anger. "No," he said firmly. "You're not leaving. Not unless you want to. If trouble comes, we'll face it together." She tilted her head, studying him with an expression he could not quite read. "Together," she repeated, testing the word. "You and me?" "Yes," he confirmed. "You and me." Something shifted in her expression, a softness entering her eyes that he had not seen before. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, her palm warm and calloused from work. The touch was brief, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with sudden, intense awareness. She withdrew her hand quickly, returning to the vegetables, but the moment lingered between them like smoke. Thomas found himself acutely conscious of her presence in a way he had not been before. The way the lamplight caught in her hair, turning it blue-black. The graceful economy of her movements as she worked. The sound of her voice when she spoke, musical even in his language. He had been so focused on helping her, on protecting her, that he had not allowed himself to acknowledge what was becoming increasingly obvious: he was developing feelings for her that went beyond simple compassion or duty. That night, as they sat by the fire as had become their custom, the air between them felt charged with unspoken things. Ayesha broke the silence first, her voice quiet but steady. "In my people," she said carefully, "when women run from marriage, she brings shame. Cannot go back. Family not want her." She paused, staring into the flames. "I have no home now. Only here." Thomas heard the weight of loss in her words, the sacrifice she had made for her freedom. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "That you lost your family, your home." She looked at him then, and her expression was fierce. "Not sorry. I choose. Choose free, not prisoner. Choose." She gestured around the cabin, at him, "this. Choose you." The words hung in the air between them, simple but profound. She had chosen him. Not out of desperation or lack of options, though those were factors, but out of something else. Trust. Recognition. Perhaps even affection. Thomas found his heart beating faster, his mouth suddenly dry. "Ayesha," he began, then stopped, unsure how to proceed. "How did you tell someone from another world, another culture, that they had become essential to you? That the thought of your life without them had become impossible to imagine?" She waited, patient as always, her eyes on his face. He took a breath and spoke, choosing his words with care. "I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you chose to stay. These past weeks, they've been. He struggled to find the right words. They've been the best I can remember. You've changed this place. Changed my life. And I want you to know that you're not just welcome here. You're wanted. By me. He watched her face as he spoke, trying to gauge her understanding. She was silent for a long moment, processing his words, and then she smiled. It was the first full smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of pain and fear that had lingered there. Wanted, she repeated, savoring the word. Yes. I understand. She paused, searching for words, then simply reached out and took his hand, holding it between both of hers. Me too, Thomas. You good man. Kind. I want stay. Want be here. With you. They sat like that for a long time, hands joined, the fire burning low between them. No more words were needed. Something had been acknowledged, a bond that had been forming since the moment he lifted her from the creek bank now given voice and recognition. When they finally separated to seek their respective beds, Thomas to his bedroll by the fire and Ayasha to the bed he had insisted she keep, the cabin felt different somehow. Fuller. Richer. As if by naming what lay between them, they had made it real in a new way. The next morning dawned bright and hot, promising another scorching day. Thomas woke early, as was his habit, and found Ayasha already up, standing by the window and looking out at the eastern horizon. There was tension in her shoulders, a rigidity in her posture that immediately put him on alert. "What is it?" he asked, joining her at the window. She pointed toward the distant rise where the land met the sky. At first, he saw nothing, but then, squinting against the glare of the rising sun, he spotted them, riders. 3 of them, still far off but moving in their direction with clear purpose. His heart sank. He knew without asking that these were the people she had fled from, come looking for their runaway bride. Ayasha had gone very still beside him, her breathing shallow, her hands clenched into fists. He could see the fear in her eyes, but beneath it something else, determination. "They come for me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The old man, his brothers. They find me." Thomas felt anger rise in him, hot and immediate. "They're not taking you," he said flatly. He moved to the wall where his rifle hung, checking that it was loaded. Ayasha caught his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "No kill," she said urgently. "Blood make more blood. Make war. You, me, everyone die." He looked at her, seeing the wisdom in her words even as every instinct screamed at him to defend what was his. But she was right. If he killed Apache men, even in defense, he would bring down violence not just on himself but on the entire territory. The fragile peace that existed would shatter, and innocent people would die. "Then what do we do?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw her making a decision, weighing options. Finally, she spoke, her words coming with careful deliberation. "I talk them. Tell them I choose. Tell them I not come back." She touched his chest. "You there. With me. They see you, see I choose you. Maybe they understand. Maybe they go." It was a risk, he knew that. But it was better than the alternative. He nodded slowly. "All right. We do it your way. But I'll have the rifle, just in case." She accepted this with a nod, and they moved outside to wait. The riders were closer now, close enough that Thomas could make out details. They were Apache warriors, dressed in traditional clothing, their faces hard and impassive. The one in the center was older, perhaps 50, with gray streaking his black hair. This would be the man she had been promised to, Thomas realized, and felt his anger kindle anew. They stopped their horses 20 yards from the cabin, their eyes taking in the scene, the white rancher standing with rifle in hand, and beside him, the woman they had come for. The old man spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the distance, words in Apache that Thomas could not understand but whose tone was clear: anger, command, expectation of obedience. Ayasha responded, her voice steady despite the tremor Thomas could see in her hands. She spoke at length, gesturing between herself and Thomas, pointing to the cabin, standing tall despite her fear. The exchange went back and forth, the old man's voice rising in anger, Ayasha's remaining firm. At one point, she stepped closer to Thomas, deliberately taking his hand in hers, a gesture that needed no translation. The old man's face darkened with rage. He spoke again, sharper now, and gestured imperiously for her to come. Ayasha's answer was short and unequivocal. She shook her head, squeezed Thomas's hand tighter, and said something that made the other two riders shift uneasily in their saddles. Thomas watched the old man's face, saw the calculation there, the weighing of options. The man could try to take her by force, but that would mean confronting an armed rancher on his own land, and the outcome of such a confrontation was uncertain. Or he could accept the loss, the public humiliation of a woman who had chosen another man, and ride away. Pride warred with pragmatism in his expression. Finally, the old man spat something that was clearly a curse, wheeled his horse around, and rode off. The other two followed, but not before one of them, a younger man who might have been Ayasha's brother, met her eyes with an expression that held both sorrow and understanding. Then they were gone, dust rising behind them, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Ayasha stood frozen for a long moment, her hand still gripping Thomas's, her body trembling with released tension. Then, all at once, her strength gave out and she collapsed against him, not crying but shaking with the force of emotion held too long in check. Thomas wrapped his arms around her, holding her steady, feeling the hammer of her heart against his chest. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "They're gone. You're safe." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears but also with triumph. "I tell them," she said, her English breaking down in her emotion. "I tell them I'm free. I choose you. I choose this life. They hear me. They go. Is done." Thomas felt something swell in his chest, pride and admiration and something deeper, something that made his voice rough when he spoke. "You were so brave. I've never seen anyone stand up like that." She smiled through her tears, and then, with a naturalness that surprised them both, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was brief, almost chaste, but it sealed something between them that words could not capture. When she pulled away, her eyes were searching his face for his reaction. Thomas answered by pulling her close again, kissing her properly this time, deeply and thoroughly, communicating everything he felt but could not yet say. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers and spoke softly. "Marry me, Ayasha. Not because you have to, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because I love you. Because I want to spend my life with you. Because you've made my house a home and my life worth living." She understood enough of his words, and what she didn't understand she read in his eyes, his touch, his expression. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I marry you, Thomas. I love you too." They stood there in the dust and heat of the New Mexico morning, holding each other, two people from different worlds who had found in each other something rare and precious. The sun climbed higher, the day progressed, but neither of them moved, content simply to be together, to savor this moment of choice and commitment. Eventually, practical concerns reasserted themselves. There were chores to be done, animals to tend, life to be lived. But everything was different now, colored by the promise they had made to each other. They worked together that day with new energy, speaking more freely, touching more often, laughing at small things that would not have seemed funny before. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, Thomas broached a practical concern. "We should go to town soon," he said. "Get married proper, legal. I want everyone to know you're my wife." Ayasha looked uncertain. "Town people, they..." She struggled for words, they not like Apache woman? Not like you marry me? It was a valid concern, and Thomas would not lie to her. Some won't like it, he admitted. Some will talk, will judge. But others will accept it. And more than that, I don't care what they think. You're going to be my wife, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me. She smiled at his fierce tone, then turned serious. Will be hard, she said softly. For you, for me. Two worlds, Thomas. Different. I know, he acknowledged. But we'll face it together. Just like we faced your people today. Together, Ayasha. That's how we'll live. She nodded, accepting this, and they continued preparing the meal in comfortable silence. But Thomas could see her thinking, working through the implications of their decision. She was not naive about the challenges they would face. A white rancher marrying an Apache woman in 1879 New Mexico would cause talk, might cause trouble. But she had already shown herself willing to face difficulties for the sake of freedom and choice. This would be no different. The next day, they rode to town together, Ayasha seated behind Thomas on Ruth, her arms wrapped around his waist. It was a 2-day journey, and they camped that night under the stars, lying side by side in their bedrolls, talking quietly until sleep claimed them. Thomas told her about his past, his parents who had died of fever when he was young, his years of drifting before settling on this land. Ayasha shared more of her own story, her childhood in the village, the family she had left behind, the dreams she had carried before circumstances had forced her to run. They arrived in town late the following day, and Thomas took her directly to the small church at the edge of the settlement. The pastor, a weathered man named Reverend Matthews, listened to their request with raised eyebrows but no immediate objection. He agreed to marry them the next day, after posting the required notice and ensuring the legality of the union. That night, they stayed at the small boarding house, in separate rooms as propriety demanded. But Thomas lay awake, thinking about the next day, about the life they were choosing together. He had no illusions that it would be easy. They would face prejudice, suspicion, isolation perhaps. But when he thought of Ayasha, of her courage and strength, of the way she had changed his life in just a few short weeks, he knew with absolute certainty that he was making the right choice. The next morning, they were married in a simple ceremony with only the Reverend and his wife as witnesses. Ayasha wore a dress they had bought at the general store, simple calico in deep blue that brought out the darkness of her hair. Thomas wore his best clothes, his hair combed back, his hands nervous as he held hers and spoke his vows. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed his bride with a tenderness that made the Reverend's wife dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. They bought supplies for the ranch, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed them through the town, and headed home that same afternoon. Neither of them wanted to spend more time than necessary among people who looked at them with judgment or curiosity. The ranch was their sanctuary, the place where they could simply be themselves without the weight of others' opinions. The journey back was slower, Ruth laden with supplies, but neither of them minded. They talked and laughed, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that felt both new and ancient. When they finally arrived at the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Thomas dismounted and helped Ayasha down, and they stood together looking at the humble structure that was now their shared home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Brennan," Thomas said softly. Ayasha smiled, trying out her new name. "Mrs. Brennan," she repeated, her accent making it sound exotic and beautiful. "Yes. Home." They unloaded the supplies together, falling into the rhythm they had established over the past weeks. But tonight was different. Tonight they would share the bed as husband and wife, would begin their life together in truth rather than in hopeful expectation. There was a nervous energy between them, an awareness of what the evening would bring. After dinner, after the cabin was tidied and the fire banked for the night, they faced each other across the small space. Thomas saw the nervousness in Ayasha's eyes, mixed with trust and something that might have been anticipation. He crossed to her slowly, giving her time, always giving her the choice. When he took her hands in his, she squeezed back, and he felt the calluses on her palms, the strength in her fingers. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly. She considered the question, then shook her head. "Not afraid. You are good. Kind. I trust you, Thomas." He raised her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I'll always be gentle with you. Always give you choice. You understand?" She nodded, and then she smiled, that beautiful smile that transformed her face. "I choose you," she said, echoing the words she had spoken to her people. "I choose this. I choose us." That night, they came together as husband and wife, and if there were awkward moments born of different customs and lingering nervousness, there was also tenderness, patience, and a deep connection that transcended words. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, skin against skin, hearts beating in synchrony, and Thomas felt a peace he had never known. This was what he had been missing all those lonely years. Not just companionship, not just physical intimacy, but this deep soul-level connection with another person who saw him truly and chose him anyway. Ayesha traced patterns on his chest with her fingertips, and he could feel her smiling in the darkness. "Happy," she murmured in English, then repeated the word in Apache, teaching him even now. "Yes," he agreed, pulling her closer. "Happy." The weeks that followed were ones of adjustment and discovery. They learned each other's rhythms, preferences, quirks. Ayesha proved to be both fierce and tender, hard-working and playful. She had a laugh that rang out across the plains when something delighted her, and a quiet strength that sustained her through difficult moments. She continued to improve her English, and Thomas continued to learn her language, until they had created between them a hybrid way of speaking, mixing both tongues with gestures and shared understanding. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Ayesha had knowledge of the land that Thomas lacked, understanding which areas would be best for grazing, where water might be found even in drought, how to read the behavior of animals to predict weather. She taught him to move more quietly through the wilderness, to observe more carefully, to work with nature rather than against it. In turn, he taught her the business side of ranching, how to keep accounts, how to negotiate with buyers, how to plan for the future. They expanded the vegetable garden, Ayesha planting crops using techniques from her people. They built a small shelter for the chickens, mended fences together, broke a young horse to saddle as a team. Every task became an opportunity for partnership, for learning, for growing closer. The cabin itself evolved, acquiring small touches that reflected Ayesha's presence, woven baskets she made from dried grasses, pottery she crafted from clay she found by the creek, designs she painted on the walls using natural pigments. But their isolation could not last forever. 2 months after their marriage, they received their first visitor. A neighboring rancher named William Morrison rode up one afternoon, ostensibly to discuss a property boundary issue but clearly motivated by curiosity about Thomas's Apache wife. Thomas saw Ayesha tense as Morrison approached, saw her move slightly closer to him, seeking his protection without seeming to. Morrison was a gruff man in his 50s, weathered by decades on the frontier. He nodded to Thomas, then studied Ayesha with undisguised interest. Thomas felt his jaw tighten, ready to defend her against whatever judgment might come. But Morrison surprised him. "Heard you got married," Morrison said without preamble. "Heard you married Apache." He looked at Ayesha directly then. "Name's William Morrison. I ranch to the north of here." Ayesha met his gaze steadily. "I am Ayesha Brennan," she said carefully, her English accented but clear. "Thomas is my husband." Morrison nodded slowly, and something in his craggy face softened. "My wife was Mexican," he said quietly. "Married her 40 years ago, when such things weren't done. She died 5 years back." He looked at Thomas. "People talked then too. Still talked when she died. But she was the best thing that ever happened to me." He paused, then added, "You treat her right, Brennan. And you," he turned to Ayesha, "you take care of this fool." Keep him from working himself to death. It was acceptance, grudging perhaps, but real. Thomas felt some of the tension drain from his shoulders. After Morrison left, having discussed the boundary issue and shared a cup of coffee, Ayesha turned to Thomas with wonder in her eyes. He was kind, she said, as if surprised. He understand. Some will, Thomas assured her. Not all, but some. And those are the ones that matter. But Morrison's visit had reminded them both that they could not hide away forever. They had supplies to buy, cattle to sell, business to conduct. The next time they went to town, they went together, heads high, prepared for whatever reception they might receive. It was mixed, as Thomas had expected. Some people stared openly, their disapproval evident. Others looked away, refusing to acknowledge them. The clerk at the general store was coolly polite but charged them higher prices than he had charged Thomas in the past. But there were also moments of kindness, a woman who smiled at Ayesha and complimented her on the basket she carried, a group of ranch hands who tipped their hats respectfully, Reverend Matthews who stopped to ask after their well-being with genuine concern. They endured the stares and whispers, completed their business, and rode home. That night, sitting by the fire, Ayesha was quieter than usual. Thomas could see the experience had affected her, though she tried to hide it. "It bothers you," he said softly. "The way they look at us." She was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I know it will be hard. I know when I choose you. But still, is hard. They see me, they see Apache. They not see Ayesha. Not see me." Thomas moved to sit beside her, taking her hand. "I see you," he said firmly. "I see Ayesha. I see my wife, my partner, the woman I love more than anything. And anyone who can't see that, who can't see how remarkable you are, that's their loss, not ours." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I am strong," she said quietly. "I can bear it. For us, for our life, I can bear it." "I know you're strong," Thomas said. "You're the strongest person I've ever known. But you don't have to bear it alone. We're in this together, remember?" She lifted her head to look at him, and her eyes were bright with emotion. "Together," she agreed. "Always together." As summer deepened into fall, their life found its rhythm. They worked hard during the day and found comfort in each other at night. Ayesha's English improved to the point where she could carry on complex conversations, though her accent remained, a musical reminder of her heritage. Thomas's Apache was passable now, enough that he could understand much of what she said when she spoke her native tongue, though his pronunciation still made her laugh. They talked about the future during those long evenings by the fire. Thomas wanted to expand the ranch, maybe buy some of the land to the west that was coming up for sale. Ayesha wanted to plant more crops, maybe raise some sheep for wool that she could weave. They dreamed together, planned together, built a vision of the life they wanted to create. One evening, as autumn began to paint the cottonwoods gold and the air carried the first hint of coming cold, Ayesha turned to Thomas with a particular expression, nervous and excited and tender all at once. "Thomas," she said softly. "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the saddle he was mending, giving her his full attention. Something in her tone made his heart beat faster. She placed a hand on her belly, the gesture so small and yet so meaningful. "I am, with child," she said, stumbling slightly over the English words. "A baby. Our baby." Thomas felt the world tilt and resettle. A baby. Their child. He set aside the saddle carefully, his hands suddenly shaking, and crossed to her. He dropped to his knees in front of her, placing his hands over hers where they rested on her still flat belly. "A baby," he repeated, wonder filling his voice. "Ayesha, we're going to have a baby." She smiled, that brilliant smile that never failed to move him. "Yes. In the spring, I think. When the land is green again." He pulled her close, burying his face against her middle, feeling the miracle of new life beginning there. When he looked up, there were tears on his cheeks, and he didn't care. "I love you," he said fiercely. "I love you so much. And I already love this child." "I love you too," she whispered, running her fingers through his hair. "You will be good father. I know this." That winter was hard, as winters always were on the frontier, but they faced it together. The pregnancy made Ayasha tired sometimes, and Thomas took on more of the heavy work, insisting she rest when she needed to. He was protective, perhaps overly so, hovering whenever she climbed a ladder or carried something heavy. She tolerated his concern with patience and occasional exasperation, reminding him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time and that she was strong. As her belly grew, Thomas found himself overcome with tenderness whenever he looked at her. She was carrying their child, the physical manifestation of their love and commitment. He would watch her moving around the cabin, one hand unconsciously resting on her growing stomach, and feel such a rush of emotion that it nearly brought him to his knees. They prepared for the baby's arrival, Thomas building a cradle from pine wood and Ayasha sewing tiny clothes and blankets. She taught him about the birthing practices of her people, and he rode to town to consult with the doctor there about what supplies they might need. The doctor, a practical man named Hayes, agreed to come when the time arrived, though the journey would take him the better part of a day. Morrison visited occasionally throughout the winter, bringing supplies and news from the wider world. He had clearly appointed himself as their unofficial guardian, checking on them during the harshest weather, making sure they had what they needed. His gruff kindness was a lifeline during those isolated months, a reminder that they were not entirely alone. Spring came late that year, the snow lingering longer than usual. But finally, the ice broke on the creek and the first green shoots appeared in the places where the sun hit strongest. Ayasha grew increasingly uncomfortable as her time approached, her movements slower, her sleep restless. Thomas watched her with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety, wanting to meet their child but worried about the dangers of childbirth, dangers that were all too real on the frontier. The baby came on a warm April morning, as the sun rose and painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Ayasha's labor began just before dawn, and Thomas sent one of the ranch hands, a young man named Pete he had hired the previous month, riding hard for town to fetch Dr. Hayes. But babies keep their own schedule, and this one was not willing to wait. Thomas had assisted with the births of countless calves and foals, but this was different. This was his wife, his child, and his hands shook as he helped her through the contractions. But Ayasha was strong, as he had always known she was. She gripped his hand so hard he thought his bones might break, but she did not scream, instead making low sounds deep in her throat as her body worked to bring their child into the world. When the baby finally emerged, slippery and perfect and wailing with healthy lungs, Thomas caught his son in trembling hands and felt his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. A son. They had a son. He placed the baby on Ayasha's chest, and she gathered him close, tears streaming down her face as she murmured to him in Apache, welcoming him, blessing him, claiming him as hers. Dr. Hayes arrived 2 hours later, Pete having made the journey in record time, but by then the crisis was past. The doctor examined mother and child, pronounced them both healthy, and praised Thomas for his steady hand during the delivery. After Hayes left, refusing payment with a gruff kindness, Thomas and Ayasha lay together in the bed, their son between them, and marveled at what they had created. "What should we name him?" Thomas asked softly, watching his son's tiny fist wave in the air. Ayasha was quiet for a moment, then said, "2 names. One from my people, one from yours. He is both. Should have both names." Thomas nodded, understanding. "What name from your people?" She studied their son's face, then smiled. "Kale. It means sparrow. Small bird, but strong, brave, can fly far." "Kale," Thomas repeated, liking the sound of it. "And for his English name?" He thought for a moment, then said, "Samuel." It was my father's name. Samuel Calais Brennan, Ayesha said, testing the full name. She nodded with satisfaction. Yes. Is good name. Strong name for strong boy. They spent the next weeks in a exhausted, joyful haze. Samuel was a good baby, healthy and alert, with his mother's dark hair and eyes that seemed to shift between Thomas's gray and Ayesha's brown. He fed well and slept in predictable patterns, and both parents fell completely in love with him. Thomas found himself sitting for hours just watching his son sleep, amazed by the perfection of his tiny fingers and toes, the softness of his skin, the sweetness of his breath. He had never imagined himself as a father, had spent so many years alone that the idea of family had seemed like something for other people. But now, holding Samuel in his arms while Ayesha rested, he could not imagine his life any other way. Ayesha flourished in motherhood. She sang to Samuel in Apache, teaching him the songs of her people even though he was too young to understand. She carried him in a cradleboard on her back while she worked, the traditional way of her people, and Thomas loved seeing them together, his wife and son, the two people who had made his life complete. Morrison came to visit when Samuel was 2 weeks old, bringing a hand-carved wooden horse as a gift. He held the baby awkwardly but tenderly, his weathered face softening as Samuel wrapped a tiny fist around his finger. "Fine boy," Morrison said gruffly. "He'll be a good rancher someday. Got his mother's spirit, I can see it in his eyes." Word of Samuel's birth spread, and over the following weeks, several other neighbors came to visit, bringing gifts and offering congratulations. Not everyone, of course. Some people still refused to acknowledge the mixed marriage, still whispered their disapproval. But enough came, enough accepted, that Thomas and Ayesha felt less isolated than they had before. Their son had created bridges that their marriage alone had not. As Samuel grew, thriving in the high desert air, Thomas and Ayesha's life continued to evolve. They were parents now, with all the responsibilities and joys that entailed. Their conversations were punctuated by Samuel's coos and cries, their sleep interrupted by his needs, their hearts continually amazed by his small achievements. One evening, when Samuel was 3 months old and sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Thomas and Ayesha sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. She was leaning against him, his arm around her shoulders, both of them tired but content. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked softly. "Leaving your people, choosing this life?" Ayesha was quiet for a long moment, and he wondered if he had made a mistake asking. But then she spoke, her voice certain and clear. "No regret," she said firmly. "Sometimes I am sad, missing my family, my mother, my brothers. Sometimes is hard, when town people look at us with hate in their eyes. But regret? No." She turned to look at him directly. "You give me freedom. You give me love. You give me son. You give me life that is mine, chosen, not forced. How can I regret?" Thomas felt emotion swell in his chest. "You gave me all those things too," he said. "I was just existing before you came. Now I'm living." She smiled and kissed him softly. "We are lucky," she said. "Many people, they never find this. Never find person who sees them true, who loves them complete. We have this. We have each other. We have Samuel. Is everything." As the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas held his wife close and listened to his son's soft breathing from inside the cabin. She was right. They had everything. Not wealth, not prestige, not the approval of everyone around them. But they had love, they had family, they had a life built on choice and respect and genuine partnership. The years ahead would bring challenges, Thomas knew that. There would be droughts and harsh winters, fluctuating cattle prices and difficult neighbors. There would be more moments of prejudice, more whispers and stares. Samuel would grow up caught between two worlds, and that would bring its own complications. But they would face it all together, this unlikely family forged in the wilderness, bound by love that had overcome every obstacle. As darkness settled over the plains and Ayesha rose to check on Samuel, Thomas sat for a moment longer, breathing in the cool evening air. He thought back to that evening 2 years ago when he had found a broken woman by the creek and made the decision to help her. It had seemed like a simple act of compassion at the time, but it had changed everything. It had brought him love, family, purpose. It had transformed his empty cabin into a home, his solitary existence into a rich and meaningful life. He stood and followed Ayesha inside, where she was lifting Samuel from his cradle for his evening feeding. The lamplight cast a warm glow over them both, and Thomas felt his heart swell with gratitude for this life, this love, this family. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. That was all that mattered. They had chosen each other, against all odds and expectations, and that choice had been the making of them both. Thomas moved to stand beside his wife, wrapping an arm around her waist as she nursed their son. She leaned into him, and the three of them stood there in the golden lamplight, a family complete and whole. Outside, the wind whispered across the plains, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. But inside the cabin, in this moment, there was only peace, only love, only the quiet certainty that they were exactly where they belonged, with exactly who they belonged with. The frontier was vast and unforgiving, but they had carved out their own small piece of it, a sanctuary where two people from different worlds could meet and love and build a future. And in doing so, they had proven that the boundaries between people existed only in minds and customs, not in hearts. Love recognized no borders, respected no artificial divisions. It simply was, powerful and undeniable and transformative. As Samuel's eyes drifted closed, milk-drunk in content, and Ayesha began to hum softly, Thomas thought about the journey that had brought them here. The pain Ayesha had endured, the loneliness he had carried, the fear and uncertainty and risk they had both accepted. None of it had been easy. But all of it had been worth it for this, for the family they had become, for the love they shared. He kissed the top of Ayesha's head, breathed in the familiar scent of her hair, and felt Samuel's tiny hand grip his finger with surprising strength. This was his life now. This was his family. And he would spend every day for the rest of his life being worthy of the trust they had placed in him, honoring the choice Ayesha had made, and building a world where Samuel could grow up knowing he was loved, knowing he belonged, knowing that he was the bridge between two worlds and the best of both. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and outside the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns across the endless sky. Time would march forward, seasons would change, years would pass. But the love in this small cabin would endure, a testament to the power of choice, the strength of compassion, and the triumph of two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful and lasting from the broken pieces of their separate pasts.